Our guest today is a highly successful Chicago businessman, civic leader, patron of the arts, and a giant contributor to Chicago's greatness. Chicago is a world-class city thanks to the efforts of people such as our guest today. Our guest today served as President and Chief Executive Officer of the Unilever Helene Curtis Business Unit from 1996 to 1998. Prior to that, he had served as President and Chief Executive Officer and as a member of the Board of Directors of Helene Curtis, a Fortune 500 company before its merger with Unilever. Among many other distinguished boards and commissions, our guest today has served as chairman of the Illinois State Board of Education. And Tom Donovan reminded me that for over 20 years in his business life, he's been an outstanding success, but he's always carved a significant niche of time to help those in education, and in many, many cases, those far less fortunate than us here today. Crain Chicago Business named him Executive of the Year in 1988. Our guest today is a graduate of Brown University with a bachelor's degree in economics. He is a giant of our community. Please welcome to the City Club of Chicago an outstanding civic leader, Ron Gidwitz. Ron?
Thanks, Jay, very much. I appreciate the accolades. You must be in the public relations business. He doesn't happen to represent me yet, but I suspect he's got something on his mind. I would also like to acknowledge Tom Donovan, who was responsible for asking me to join you all here today. Tom's been a great friend of mine for many, many years. He and I go back to the days when he was in City Hall. He was a tremendous public servant. He was a tremendous business person when he was at the Board of Trade, and now he's a tremendous entrepreneur. And it's my privilege, Tom, to have you as a friend. It's also my pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to be here to talk about something that I think is terribly important and of the moment. We all have the opportunity to read the newspapers. It's not surprising that we have some problems in state funding of various activities. What I'd like to talk about today is the difficulties that I see as the former chair of the State Board of Education in funding our schools. We are very clearly facing a terrible school crisis in Illinois. Illinois has over 2.2 million youngsters in our schools, and simply there isn't enough money as we are presently structured to take care of the problems that we are currently facing. What I'd like to do this afternoon is to spend a little bit of time talking about those problems which are right here, right now. Today, despite what you've heard over the last couple of years about a massive teacher shortage, schools are firing their teachers. They're cutting high-risk programs. They're eliminating such things as sports, art, music, and slashing other invaluable courses. And despite the PR-driven headlines of our governor, his proposed budget doesn't make it better. At best, to use a sort of well-worn phrase, his proposals place Band-Aids on bullet wounds in just a few districts. With last year's cut of $167 million from classrooms, plus the cost of inflation, escalating salaries and benefits, and parenthetically, personnel costs make up some 85% of a school district's budget. The budget proposed by our governor doesn't begin to fix the problems that our schools are facing. I am, ladies and gentlemen, not here to sugarcoat the problems, or to talk politics or to bash our governor for that matter. What I really need to do is to get you to understand the kinds of problems that we're facing so that we can do something on behalf of Illinois' children who have done nothing wrong. We tend to say children are our future, but the education budget spelled out by the governor doesn't make for a good future at all. Governor Blagojevich's budget proposes to make it look like education is being addressed, but in fact, we are giving the school children short shrift. For example, Waukegan School District 60, which is considered to be the single biggest winner in his budget, gets $5.5 million of new money. The problem with that is that they are currently operating with a deficit of $30 million and have been operating on that way for some number of years. The governor proposes to increase the foundation level $250 per student. That foundation level supplements those districts with the least property tax wealth in the state. It assures that public schools in poor districts will at least receive supplemental funds from the state so that a minimum of currently $4,560 is invested in each child. The governor's proposal raises that number to $4,810 per child. This cost increase of $250 per child to the foundation level will cost the state $234 million. This is an increase that the children need, and this is clearly an increase that I would support. In the area of special education today, regretfully, local school districts are only receiving part of the allocation that the state originally intended when they started paying for special education costs. And last year, the General Assembly reduced state money in their state formula from 100% funding of that formula to 91%. The governor's budget proposal maintains that proration at 90%, maintains it, and that costs $87 million. Again, we agree, I certainly agree, with increasing the money for what they call the mandated categoricals, the special education funds, but I happen to think we ought to be paying 100% of those dollars. The $87 million increase barely, frankly, doesn't quite cover the cost of inflation on a year-over-year basis. The governor's proposal includes as well $25 million to clear the waiting list for early childhood and preschool programs, and that's good. I also support his proposed special education and preschool investment, although I believe that we should be supporting a larger percentage of that. Unfortunately, in order to pay for these programs, the 234 plus the 87 plus the 25 plus a couple of other very small programs, the governor has elected to eliminate 24 critical line items in our budget which cover programs which will undoubtedly not be supported in the local school districts because they won't have the resources. We're talking about cutting such things as a very large effort to fight truancy in our state, as well as to deal with the problems of substance abuse that we see in our schools. Funds for textbooks for schools across the state have been eliminated. We spend a very little money on gifted children. That money's been eliminated. We spend some money, about $1,200,000 for the visually impaired. That money has been completely eliminated from our budget. So I guess parenthetically, you might ask the question, why are we teaching those kids to read Braille when they don't have any school books or won't have any school books that they'll be able to use? Clearly, this is not a very helpful situation for many of our school districts. And lastly, one of the elements of the governor's budget does include $127 million to cover the skyrocketing costs of downstate and suburban teachers' pensions. I will say also, although it may have changed more recently, parenthetically, with the increase of $127 million for downstate pensions, the governor's original budget as it was published eliminated $65 million, the relatively small amount that the state contributes to the Chicago pension system. The total amount that will be going to downstate and suburban pensions this year will be $1,093 million in the budget. And Arnie Duncan, who's with us today, can certainly attest that the original draft of the budget that was presented to the General Assembly called for an elimination of the $65 million contribution so that Chicago ends up funding their pension costs out of the classrooms, which they've done to a great degree for many, many years. If they were to get their appropriate allocation, which was the intention of the General Assembly back in the mid-90s, the state would be supporting the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund with a contribution of $273 million at a minimum. Anyway, so that's missing. Contrary to the headlines about the total increase which the governor seems to be getting across the state, it seems to me that what we have with this proposed budget is a budget which will deal with the cost of inflation or almost the cost of inflation for the special ed payments, a small, effectively a small amount of money for some early childhood activities, and a contribution to the teacher's pension fund. And if, in fact, Arnie gets the $65 million, which is sort of off budget that I saw in the paper this morning that he was promised by the governor, that would effectively raise the amount of money, the increase in the general state aid to schools overall to the grand sum of 2%. The problem with that, ladies and gentlemen, is that with 85% of the cost of education being human resources, I don't think there's a contract in this state with teachers and administrators that is rising at 2% or less. They're all in the area of 3.5%, 4%, or more, and that doesn't deal with the issue of benefits. So this, unfortunately, this budget, as the governor is proposing, basically holds the line on spending without considering inflation. And obviously, once you adjust for inflation, the schools are under significantly more pressure. That's an overview of the current budget. Let me tell you, give you the baseline information about where the schools are, just to give you a sense of the kind of problem that we're facing. Right now, this year, 8 out of 10 of the 893 school districts in the state of Illinois are operating at a deficit. 163 of those districts have been in a deficit position of 3 years or more, and many of them for 5 years or more. With that kind of a problem, it's surprising to me that the governor would eliminate one of the line items in our budget that deals with schools that are about to go bankrupt. But that was one of the additional lines that he eliminated from our budget. For example, Elgin School District 46 has shaved $40 million worth of operating costs out of their budget. They're the second largest school district in the state. They've got roughly 5,000 employees, 2,400 teachers. They have noticed in 2 waves about 1,100 of those 2,400 teachers that they may not be coming back next year. In February, the Gurnee School District, District 56, lost a referendum for a operating education fund increase for the 3rd time. They're laying off, and it's a very small school district, they're laying off 13 of their teachers. Elk Grove District 59 will be eliminating 15 teachers next year. Ludwig Walsh, 18 teachers, 33 others. Class sizes in that district will go from 35 children to a class to 40 kids to a class. And at the same time, they're going to shrink the school day by an hour. Fieldcrest District 6 near Peoria. Student classes, extracurricular activities, and teaching staff have been targeted for a $608,000 savings. This means eliminating 8th grade algebra, middle school art, home economics, the high school's industrial technology program, freshman sports, and 5th and 6th grade sports. In Quincy, the board approved a $2.2 million series of cuts, and they include shortening the school day, eliminating 50 teaching positions, including all of those teaching positions that deal with K-6 physical education, art, music. They were eliminating 11 para-educators and 5 building leadership positions, which means there's not going to be no principal in a building. Now that, maybe schools don't need a principal, but I haven't met many superintendents who have figured out how to run a school that way. The list goes on. I mean, I wish we could joke about it. It really is. It's tragic. This is so bad, ladies and gentlemen, and this is not a pitch. I was so frustrated last year when we cut $167 million out of the classroom that I have started a thing called Students First Foundation. You can find our website at www.studentsfirst.us. The whole concept here is to educate the public that they need to talk to their legislator. They need to talk to their legislator about the commitments they made when they ran for office. I can't think of too many legislators that didn't run on a platform that education was their #1 priority or one of their #1 priorities. Nonetheless, when they get down to Springfield, somehow they figure out that education is just another special interest and they treat it as such. And when it comes time to allocating the money from the state's budget, a little for transportation, a little for correction, a little for human services, and some for education. And the concept here, ladies and gentlemen, is let's get education funded first. And then let's take care of the rest of the interests of the state. And that isn't to say that there aren't many other very important interests, but I can't think of anything that's more important than taking care of our youngsters. Let me give you just a few data points here. I don't think I have too much longer that I'm allowed to speak, so I'd like to get some questions. consider, Illinois is 48th in the nation in terms of the share of education funding by the state. We are 49th in the nation. This is almost to 50. 49th in the nation in terms of the differential between the wealthiest school districts and the poorest school districts. So if you were in, say, Lake Forest or Kenilworth or some of the northern suburbs or western suburbs, you're right at the top of the heap. But then we can go down to places like Cairo and East St. Louis and Pembroke and Vienna and a whole bunch of other school districts, or even closer to home in South Cook County, and we are at the bottom of they're at the bottom of the heap. And the distance between the bottom and the top, when you look at the median of the first quartile and the fourth quartile, that distance puts us 49th out of 50 states in terms of equity. We are 37th in terms of how we fund our highest poverty districts, which is, again, just reinforces the point that I was making a second ago. It is, I must tell you, not a very happy situation. If we adopt the governor's budget, I venture to say what we're condoning is a continuing increase in disparities between the haves and the have-nots. We will be tolerating the increases in our truancy rolls. We will be, in effect, increasing the waiting list for various educational sites and specialized educational programs such as special ed kids with disabilities. We are sanctioning the reduction of students that will be able to meet the federal requirements. And quite frankly, I don't understand why we need federal requirements to tell us that we ought to teach all children, get them to a point where they are performing at grade level. But we as a state, and frankly it's probably true with every state in the nation, haven't been able to figure out that it's our responsibility to educate our young. And so it took a federal piece of legislation, No Child Left Behind. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if we don't put the money in the system, there's no chance that we'll even fulfill the federal mandate, let alone our obligation under the Constitution to educate our young. We are, as a consequence, or will be, embracing a declining climate for business investment. The quality of the workforce, needless to say, will cause us to push more and more jobs overseas, because here and other places around the country, we will not have the kind of skilled workforce that we need. Let me just take a minute. On this website I mentioned a moment ago, I got this note from a teacher that I think is worth just quoting for a second. And that reads, I fear that as a history teacher, I will someday have to teach about another lost generation. This generation won't be lost to the horrors of war. Rather, they will be lost to something even more horrific, a society's lack of concern for its young. And I couldn't agree with them more. It is a tragedy. Every child in Illinois deserves a good, solid education. We at the state level ought to be providing the resources to be able to ensure that every child has that good, solid, full education, and we aren't doing it. And we aren't doing it, and we won't do it unless everyone here and everyone else in this state insists that their legislators fulfill the mandate that the Constitution puts forward to make education a primary responsibility of the state. We can't have an education system which doesn't have art, that doesn't have music, that doesn't have sports, that doesn't have physical education, that only teaches reading, writing, mathematics, and science, social studies. I mean, what kind of an education is that? I suggest it's not real. It wasn't the kind of education that we were blessed with. It certainly isn't the kind of education that we want for our own children. And why should we have it for the state's children? With that, let me just wrap up. I suspect that there may be some questions. All I can say is, if we are going to do something, now is the time to do it. Next year is an election year. It is unlikely that radical steps will be taken by our legislature in the face of both a presidential and a senatorial election, with all the House, the State House, and part of the Senate up for election. We need to do something now. I am advocating that we don't need to raise taxes to fund education. We can fund education out of the general revenue of the state if that is the will of the people. We need to make it the will of the people this year. We need to make our legislators understand that it's important. We need to make them go down to Springfield when the budget bill comes to the General Assembly for a vote, and they need to say, no, we're going to make sure our kids get a fair shake. With that, let me stop. Thank you very much. And,
sandbag anybody. anybody you like.
Et voila. Okay. My name's Lucy Morrows. I'm with Campus Indirects, and I want to say that your speech was very compelling. And as you are searching for answers of how to deal with this difficult economic reality, I have a question about assets. It seems to me that as a citizen, I see that the schools have a great number of, they're rich in assets, but they're very poor in cash. Have you or other members of the leadership been looking to develop ways to leverage buildings, land, infrastructure in order to put the economics in a more powerful and productive way? Is that clear?
It's clear to me. Shall I
Okay.
repeat it to make sure I understand it? Why don't we borrow money on the buildings in order to pay for today's problems? Is that a fair?
Yeah, I think that what I'm looking for is to see what kinds of things that you are doing in order to take the assets that you have, buildings, land, infrastructure, and perhaps leverage them in some new ways. Are you thinking through new ways? Because it's going to require that kind of thing in the future in order to handle this very serious economic downturn.
Well, I guess the question gets to be, is this a problem that's just with us for the moment, in which case, if I understand you correctly, borrow the money and use it to fund a deficit, and then when the situation eases, then we can pay the money back. That's sort of how I understand the question. Is that because ultimately there's not any, you can't create something from nothing. So if we're going to leverage the properties, use some creative ways, which generally means let's go take a second mortgage, take a mortgage, sell the property, lease it back, whatever it is, you have received a bunch of cash, financed today, and then you have to pay that cash back tomorrow, unless you can raise taxes. There's some expectation that you can raise taxes or generate revenue some other way tomorrow, which I'm not at all sure that's possible. I would argue that's probably a very short-term solution to what is a very significant problem, and I would not advocate that. The legislature mandated, and the governor a couple of years ago paneled a thing called the Education Finance Advisory Board. They issued a report last summer which, amongst other things, had a variety of ways to save money, which I thought were thoughtful, many of which were thoughtful. They suggested as well offloading part of the real estate property taxes and increasing the income tax commensurately to pay for it, which is not necessarily a new idea. We've had certainly Governor Edgar, during his administration, at least on one occasion, it might have been twice, tried to do that, and it failed. There's a bill in the Senate right now that advocates for doing that, and advocates as well for leaving. This would not be a cost-neutral activity. The Education and Finance Advisory Board estimated that there ought to be $1.8 billion of new money going to education from the state. And so there's a differential between how much real estate property tax is reduced and how much income taxes are increased, in roughly $1.8 billion. My view is that that's probably not enough money if you really want to substantively deal with the problems of the very difficult to educate children who are essentially mostly in the poorest school districts in the state. We're probably talking closer to $3 billion of new money required to do this job. And I'm afraid that if we were to go out and start borrowing on school assets to do that, and this is a continuing need, this is on an annual basis, we would be just creating a bigger problem than is currently being created by the governor by borrowing the $10 billion to fund the pension funds currently. I mean, anyway. Yes.
Who was the gentleman?
Jeff Berkowitz, host and producer of Public Affairs, airing every Monday night at 8:30, Channel 21.
And a great
TV.
show.
One of our more honorable guests, Ron Gidwitz, and in fact another recent honorable guest, Paul Green. Let me see. When Mr. Gidwitz, when you were on my show, we talked about something. Let me see if your answer's changed a bit in the last month or two.
Regretfully, I don't remember what the answer was. So try
Hope
me out.
springs eternal in the breast of a voucher proponent. But seriously, you've talked about a lot of numbers this afternoon. One, I'm not sure I heard you mention, is the $18 billion with a B that is spent on public education in the state of Illinois when you consider the money that comes from the federal government, from the state government, and then from the local governments on real estate taxes. You did mention the 2.2 million students. If you divide one into the other, it says we're spending on average on education in the public schools in the state of Illinois about $8,100, a little more per student per year. I don't see politically, perhaps you do, an appetite to increase that average to 9,000 to 10,000. I don't see politically an appetite to take some of the funds from the $18,000, say, per year that's spent on New Trier High School, including all costs, and give some of that to the city of Chicago or to Cairo. And I don't see a lot of appetite to take money from other sectors in the state government and transfer it to education, as you seem to be suggesting. So until you change that political appetite to do some of those things, then perhaps it's a good idea to, as some would argue, to see if we can take the money that we are spending and get more output, more services, through competition, through innovation. So take that $7,900, which I think you told me that the city of Chicago is spending per year per student on an operating basis, put it in my famous backpack, and give that backpack to every family and let them choose where do they want that backpack to go, and the money will follow the backpack and the kid. Private schools will arise to meet that demand because we know that demand creates its own supply. Why not give that a try, and if it doesn't work, then I'll join you and try to lobby for greater spending to change the political will. And I think you favored that approach at one point, school voucher, school choice. So the question is, would you still speak on its behalf?
Let me be very clear. I have always favored vouchers. I favored vouchers. I continue to favor vouchers. I don't happen to think it's realistic, and it may be not realistic in this state. And let me give you two reasons why. Reason number one is because the teachers' unions have been very effective in lobbying against adequate funding, and the model that I would point to is the adequate funding for charter schools. Charter school, we have 45 charter schools. We've just added another 15 charter schools to the list, and now up to 60 permissible. If you open a charter school, we don't adequately fund you. The state doesn't adequately fund you, the school district doesn't adequately fund you, and the union has made sure that there's no capital money for charter schools across the state. And as a consequence, in order to open a charter school, you need to have the philanthropy pay for charter schools. So I think that's problem number one. Problem number two, I think realistically, to take vouchers to scale in most places is unrealistic. You might be able to do it in Chicago because you've got a school board that is very willing to do almost anything to ensure that youngsters get a decent education. And I mean that, Arnie, as an absolute compliment both to you and your board. They will try anything, and they will go the extra distance. They will help private sector people. But that's not the case in the rest of the state. And I don't think either because of the mindset of the local political establishment or of the private sector to get involved in these kinds of political activities in the face of a very compelling and difficult union, you're going to be able to take it to scale in most places. So while I think vouchers would be terrific as a test, as a pilot, as a something, it won't solve our problems. That is, and I don't think my position has changed.
But so then, to be clear, it's a political difference. That is, you don't think politically it can be accomplished, given the power of teachers' unions in the state of Illinois?
I don't think politically, frankly, I think it'll be very difficult economically to be able to generate a sustainable, long-term voucher system that works in this state.
But you would like
from
to
an
give
economic
it,
standpoint.
you would like to give it a try?
I would try it. I would try it in Chicago. I would try it. I advocated for years for taking the most crowded schools and the least performing schools to get those kids out of those classrooms. Effectively, what now the federal law is embodied in law. Let's take care of the youngsters who are in the most disadvantaged environments. So yes, I would support it. What did I say on your show?
Same thing? I just thought they might want to hear it. They might have missed the show.
Very good, Joe. Yes, please.
Hi, Catherine Gale. Ron, I appreciated your comments, agree with the priority of funding education first, and understand the urgency of doing something this budget year. What I'd like to hear a little more on is the next steps, the to-dos. So you speak here, perhaps there's a lot of agreement in this room. How many letters have to be written? Who has to be talked to, and in what kind of time frame to actually make something significant change in a budget that's already, line itemed out in a year when there's not extra? And, where would that knowledge of even to carry those steps out come from? Which brings me to, is this possible that we can make this change happen? Because I get on a bandwagon if I thought something were possible, if I saw what it was that needed to be done, and perhaps there are others that would do so. If you could comment.
I think it's very difficult for any of us in the room to spend the next 60 days in Springfield to negotiate a budget. So I completely understand, Catherine, what you're talking about. But I think we can deal with the problem more simply. The Students First Foundation essentially is advocating that, yes, we recognize the state's got a problem. Therefore, let's just return the funding levels to schools, for schools, to what it was 2 years ago, adjusted for inflation. And so instead of the governor's $200 million increase, and his includes pension money for at least the downstate and suburban districts, I'm advocating for $500 million before you consider whatever the pension needs are. And I actually happen to believe the pensions ought to be taken out of our budget. That would return the school districts to the level of funding that they had in the year 2002 and adjusted for inflation. And quite honestly, I got a couple of little pieces for early childhood and some emergencies, but under $50 million. And ladies and gentlemen, a $6.2 billion budget, that's not a significant amount of slush in it. So I'd start with that. But the issue gets to be, what can you do? And I suggest, go to our website. We have a pledge on there. We're asking you to go talk to your legislator and tell him that there's going to be consequences if he doesn't take care of, or he or she doesn't take care of youngsters. And the pledge form essentially says, we're going to recognize that we have a constitutional duty, which we do, to educate the youngsters. It's written in Article 10 of the Illinois State Constitution. We have a duty to ensure that the kids are adequately provided for. So let's take the state board's recommendation, and let's take this budget, instead of putting in $200 million, put in $600 or $550 million, whatever the number ultimately turns out to be, and let's have them vote that first. Vote it separately from the rest of the budget. Fulfill the education requirement, then deal with the rest of the issues. And I don't want to suggest that they're not important. There are really some very difficult issues on the state's plate today to deal with budgetarily. But for $500 million plus pensions, I would argue that we could take care of a significant number of the problems this year. It has got to be more next year, and it's got to be more the following year, because we aren't particularly treating with the kids who are the least able to learn, those youngsters from disadvantaged communities, not the ones that Jeff's talking about. We can't take it from Lake Forest. We can't take money from Kenilworth or Naperville. Instead of bringing the top down, we've got to find a way to bring the bottom up, which means it's going to cost net more money.
And so you've answered almost all of my question. I know to go to the website, and that's where we can suggest the specifics of what we'd like our legislature to do. How do we get enough people, and what is enough people actually talking to the legislature? Given that we can't all go down to Springfield, what is enough that could change this?
Well, you can go back to my website. Instead of just taking the pledge form, sign up, and we are trying to organize chapters across the state of interested people who will then go talk in face-to-face with their legislators. I was at a rally over the weekend in Canton, Illinois. We had the West Central chapter. It was 11 counties were covered. We had a bunch of regional superintendents of education. We had superintendents of school districts, parents, kids, teachers. There are a lot of people that are really interested. We need to give them a vehicle, and I'm trying to do that to the extent I can on this website, putting people in contact with other people. We have a group up in northern Illinois in McHenry County and Lake County. We were down in Springfield a couple weeks ago. And I'm going around the state doing this. I mean, I'm just pleased to have the opportunity today to come and talk to all of you. But we signed up, for example, Paul Simon's helping us in southern Illinois. He's a great help. We've got, on the website, you'll find some PSAs. It's probably not applicable to this community, but maybe Jeff can put it on his cable. We've got, Paul Simon did a PSA for us. We've got a PSA that talks about if you're not, if you haven't graduated from high school, let me put it the other way, 70% of the people in correctional facilities haven't graduated from high school. I mean, think about that. So if we can educate everybody, we can take a whole lot of people eventually out of the correctional systems. So we're doing that. But fundamentally, it's going to be one-on-one. Get your legislator to do the right thing. We're talking to people across the state. It won't take very many people, as those people that have been involved politically in the legislative process down in Springfield, to screw up this budget and cause the powers that be to think twice about it. and I don't want to go on too long about it, but one extra point. When we were in Canton, the chairman of the Appropriation Committee for Education didn't show up at the meeting. He went to a dedication of a fire truck. We had several hundred people, and they were outraged that he didn't show up. All of a sudden, yesterday, when they held a hearing in Springfield on the education budget, this guy demanded that they have a committee of the whole meet, which will be now meeting next Tuesday to talk about education. It is getting attention. This guy got the message. Representative Smith got the message. We need to make sure that everybody gets the message.
Great, and then maybe even the Sun-Times can have an editorial about the message.
Yeah. I noticed that Mr. Cruikshank was making notes.
John Cox. Ron, I agree with you wholeheartedly that education is the most important thing. You know, in Washington, there's a doctrine called the Washington Monument Theory, and that is when anybody proposes cutting expenses, the first thing that legislators do is they get up and they talk about closing the Washington Monument because there's not enough people to operate it. That necessitates the immediate outrage that the Washington Monument would close. I see the same thing happening. I agree with you that we need to have education as number one, but the taxpayers of this state already spend more on taxes than they spend on food, clothing, and housing combined. So going back to people and asking them for more money is a very difficult thing, and I think that's why you're seeing tax referendums being defeated all over the state. Yet they read in Mr. Cruikshank's wonderful newspaper, which I read every morning and love, about a state senator, Arthur Berman, who gets employed by the Board of Education at a salary of $140,000 and increases his state pension as a result, a very alarming thing, and then gets rehired after he's retired. But we don't hear about the cost savings on administrative levels. All we hear about are reducing the algebra teachers and cutting art, music, and industrial technology out of classrooms, which is so important. I was the president of a school board of a school in the Chicago area that spent a fraction, an absolute fraction. It was a private school, it was a parochial school, but they spent a small fraction. They used every single penny and they put it into the classroom. They didn't spend it on administration. I'm involved with Hales Franciscan now. Same story. A wonderful school sends a lot of great kids to a lot of great universities, but they do it on a fraction of what the Chicago Public Schools. I think the answer is what Jeff said, and that's vouchers to impose efficiency. But do you think that there could be more of an effort done at cutting administrative support, cutting some of the downtown expenses, for example, the Chicago Public Schools?
We can always cut more. I don't want to suggest that there aren't inefficiencies that we can find in any institution. But let's remember that they are human endeavors, and they are by their nature inefficient, so that it's awfully easy to find that $600 screwdriver and crowbar. But in reality, I think that in terms of the total, the cost of administration is relatively low. And the Chicago Public School System, just to use an example, has got one of the lowest percentages of cost. Now, granted, they got the biggest operations, so their administrative costs happen to be one of the lowest in the state. And can Arnie find some more savings? Sure. Is everything that Arnie's doing needed? Maybe not. But I bet there's a whole lot of things he wish he were doing and isn't because he doesn't have the money to do it. And I think you end up with some trade-offs. But you're never going to have the perfect running operation. When I ran Helene Curtis, and I did so as a CEO for almost 20 years, I always try to get the cost down. I mean, we whipped our people. And I can't tell you how many times I was infuriated by the waste that we found. And everybody there was focused because we're paying him to be, and we're bonusing him to be focused on saving money, building sales, making a profit. Well, but irrespective, I could never get all the waste out, is my point. In spite of the fact I had competition, in spite of the fact that we were really focused on that stuff, we had people that were extraordinarily well trained to look for those issues. We were never able to get all the waste out. But when you get finished with looking at the administrative costs on a relative basis are small. That's not the issue. And let me just speak for a moment about the parochial school model. I served from the beginning of this, in the inception of the Cardinals' Big Shoulders Fund. I was there for 13 years and only resigned when I took this job on the state board because by law I couldn't serve on an agency that, on the state board if I was governing that agency, so I had to quit. But I think, unfortunately, and we see it every spring, I think the parochial school system, particularly the Catholic parochial school system in this city, is a flawed model. Flawed model because that you pay so little. teachers, well-intentioned teachers, get experience in those schools. They then go to work for Arnie at a higher salary. And how many did you hire? 800 this year, Arnie? Something like that. And then after a few years with Arnie, if they're really good, they then go out to the suburban school districts where you start at about 70, or you can get paid for experienced teachers $70,000, $80,000 a year. So there's a career track which unfortunately does not include the least advantaged, poorest, and most difficult to educate kids. And the parochial school system, certainly in Chicago, which has about 35,000 kids in the Catholic parochial school system, is trying to teach them. They're doing a heck of a job, under very difficult circumstances. Their salary rates are about half, maybe to 2/3, but mostly half of what the public school is paying. And the transitory nature of the teachers there is alarming. Sorry. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Ron. Diana Nelson from the Union League Club of Chicago. I agree with what you said and would certainly sign on to help lobby our legislators. But I also believe that what we have is a structural deficit and that it'll be a long time before we get the political will to be there. There are, from time to time, commissions and ideas that bubble up, and I'd like to try out 3 on you, and they are probably politically not doable. But I'd like to see what the thinking is of the state board and whether or not you think any of these would fly or have any merit. One would be to do away with the categoricals, combine all the categoricals, maybe except for special ed, and give local school districts a great deal more flexibility so that they could use their money the way they see fit.
Let me stop there. Let me answer them one at a time, because I have the same problem that this general in Doha had. He couldn't remember more than one question at a time. And I'll have that problem too.
Okay.
So let's deal with the categorical issue. Some of the categoricals you can certainly consolidate. Many of the categoricals are consolidated in Chicago. We did it in 1995 with school reform. You were part of the program, as was I. And I think it's working terrifically for Arnie. I think for many of our school districts, though, there are some of the categoricals that you may not want to consolidate. For example, early childhood is considered to be it's a line item in our budget. We call it a categorical. If school districts got the money in the general state aid formula as opposed to as a categorical, many school districts will not be spending their money where it would be best spent in the early childhood years, and it would end up as teacher salary for the existing and future teachers for K-12. And we would lose that portion, which by all the research I've seen suggests that we ought to be, if we had scarce resources and we only had one choice, let's put the money in early childhood first and get those kids up to speed by the time they get to K or first grade. So I think the reasonable answer is yes, but then again, you're going to find yourself, what do you want to do about the visually impaired? That's a line item in our budget. We feel strongly about bilingual, more strongly politically, I suppose, than otherwise, but there's a significant amount of bilingual education money, which is a categorical item in our budget. There's a very strong political will to keep that separate. And there's a constituent for almost every line in our budget. We were able to do it for Chicago. We'd certainly be happy to talk about it. The Governor Ryan tried to do it last year, got his fingers singed a little bit. Governor Blagojevich is effectively doing that now. 24 lines in our budget are now being consolidated and essentially making up mostly this $250 foundation level grant plus the special ed mandated categorical grant. So it's happening. I don't think it'll last, and I don't happen to agree with all of the money that's being block granted in that fashion. Question 2.
Another idea is to impose a statewide property tax only on commercial and industrial, because what that would do would capture some of the money that's in.
Sit down, Roper.
Hey, Roper, we'll talk later. That would capture some of the money that's in great, very large shopping centers like Oak Brook Center or, nuclear power plants and spread it around a little.
That's terrific if you're talking about retail centers and you don't happen to be near a state border. But if you talk to Jim Houlihan, who's currently our county assessor, I'm not going to answer the question. If you look at the data from 1990 to the year 2000, the share of businesses paying the real estate property tax in Cook County, which has got a very screwy two-tiered system, the share of the business taxes being paid has gone from 48% in 1990 to 40% in the year 2000. And Mr. Houlihan suggests that that's classification system we use in Cook County is flawed because it's essentially chasing business out of the county. What you're suggesting is, with the possible exception of retail establishments, if you didn't tax anybody near the border, is let's chase all the businesses out of the state. And I don't think that makes a whole lot of sense either, because we got enough trouble with jobs in the state. If you create a situation where it is uneconomic with one more cost, forget about how you characterize it, whether it's the cost of another real estate taxes on business, whether it's the cost of a poor workforce on business. I spend a fortune every year educating undereducated people to come work in my factory. That many businesses in this community are already spending money on because the education system is flawed. If you now add this extra cost, you just accelerate the rate that people are going out of the state. And I had a conversation 2 nights ago, my Dell computer broke. I got to talk to somebody in Bombay who was servicing the computer. We can go that far. Question 3.
I've taken up too much of, I've taken up too much of your time, but the other really politically impossible one would be to say, as a state, we can't afford to comply with No Child Left Behind. So we're going to just turn down the federal money and work on it ourselves. And,
Well,
that's
I think there's some moral and ethical issues there.
be tricky.
I mean, the first question is, why does the federal government say No Child Left Behind is important? And to cut to the chase on No Child Left Behind, it says by the year 2014, every kid in the public system of Illinois should be performing at grade level, be they at graduating from high school or be they at first, second, third grade. Why do we need the federal government to tell us that we ought to educate our youngsters properly? So, I mean, just saying we're going to take a proactive stance not to educate our kids properly, it's very problematic. We ought to be educating our kids because A, it's our duty and responsibility, and B, because the Constitution says we ought to do it. Why do we need the federal government to do it? And then not to take federal money is a real problem, because now you're going to discriminate against youngsters with special needs. We'll get more federal lawsuits than I can count in about 3 minutes from people who feel that the state is negligent not accepting federal money and their kid has a need. And certainly there's nobody in this room that wants to pay for those needs if they don't have to, if you can push that burden off to the federal government. So all you're suggesting then is that we will have legal expenses as well as those costs. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Joyce Saxon. I serve on the Board of Governors of City Club with Ron Gidwitz. Question. The governor has floated the idea of reshuffling gaming licenses and perhaps putting a poker slot machine in every bar in the state of Illinois. Will that help the kids at all, or will it just make their parents hopeless gambling addicts?
Well, I remember when lottery was introduced, the concept of the lottery was that the money would go to education. But that was a shell game. That was similar to the boats and the slot machines and what have you. Whatever dollar is contributed net to education, that dollar is taken out of the general revenue that the State Board of Education receives to be distributed to kids. So the reality is that unless that money is earmarked in a very special way, it's not going to have any effect whatsoever, except that we'll have a lot of people who will be living, a lot more people who will be living in the street. Arnie will have a lot of difficulty with the McKinney Act, which he's got to educate people in these facilities across the state across the city for homeless, and we'll have that problem across the state in far greater degree than we have now. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure.